And welcome everyone to the Barclays Frenzy 2023. I'll put these on now. I didn't see them before. So the first panel today is looking at AI, artificial intelligence. It's become a ubiquitous phrase used increasingly throughout the world and more in everyday conversations. And some of the most popular resources and online tools, things like search engines, virtual assistants, drones, facial recognition, image labeling, popular applications, Facebook, TikTok, Netflix, YouTube, Amazon, all my favorite ones. They all use AI. And I'm only just scratching the surface here when I list those. And there's also AI-specific software. We've probably all heard of ChatGPT, Lumen, SoundDraw, DALL-E, and Stable Diffusion. But what does it all mean for us? And more importantly, what does it mean for you, the games industry? I'm Sam Collins. I'm co-CEO of UKI, the Games Trade Association. I've gathered what I think are some of the brightest minds to discuss this intriguing topic. You're not happy with that description, Vincent?
Some of. Yeah.
Some of it. Well, we'll let you decide whether I pick the right people to come and join us. I'm going to firstly ask them to introduce themselves. Vincent, we're going to start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Hi, yes, my name is Vincent. Thanks very much for the invitation to come here. I've worked principally in the law in video games for 25 years. I started out in '97 as an in-house lawyer at a publisher. I also was one of the founders of Payload Studios here in London, and I'm the general counsel at Rebellion, based in Oxford.
I'm Kostya Lobov. I'm a partner at Harbord & Lewis, a law firm based in London. We've been doing work with the games industry since the early 90s, sort of the early console wars, and ever since then, and I co-head the video games practice there.
Everyone, my name is Phil. I'm the founder and CEO of GG Insurance Services. We're a Lloyd's broker. We specialize in insurance and risk for the games industry and working with clients to sort of help them through that and getting coverage in place. So we're exhibiting if you want to come and chat to us later.
Lovely. Thank you very much for those introductions. Really, I want to start by setting the scene, and this is more about our panel than me. So, Kostya, I'm going to ask you to set the scene for us. Can we have, dare I say, a legal definition of what AI is?
Yeah, so we obviously discussed this as all fake, right? But what I was going to say is, in a way, it's quite an easy question because there is no legal definition of AI, right? I'm not going to get out of it that easy. I'm going to say something useful, but maybe I can instead talk a little bit about how it's used in the industry, and as in, like, when we talk about AI in the industry, what do we actually mean, and what specifically are we talking about? So a little disclaimer, I'm obviously a lawyer who happens to be a nerd and is into this stuff. I'm not an expert. I don't code. I don't deal with AI at the nuts and bolts level, but I am interested in it, and obviously I've done a fair amount of reading. AI is a massively broad umbrella term. So when we talk about it, it really could mean anything from quite old technology that's been around for decades, all the way through to the stuff that's actually making the headlines since, ChatGPT went viral whenever it was November last year. They're all very, very different things. Generally, what we're talking about, the stuff that people are interested in at the moment, is generative AI, which is a subset of AI. That's basically AI which, through machine learning, which is a subset of AI, turns an input of some sort into an output of another sort, having been trained on a data set as to how to do that before. And if we drill down a bit deeper, some of the interesting trendy models that we're talking about, and I've been making headlines recently, particularly use a model called diffusion. And this is, so obviously Stable Diffusion gets its name from that. One thing to point out is that, DALL-E and Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, all of these things might look like they in principle do the same thing. So you put in a text prompt, you get an image out, but they work in completely different ways, or in very different ways. And it might not seem that way from the outside, but when you start digging into the nuts and bolts and analyzing whether or not something is an infringing act, for example, as far as copyright is concerned, it becomes very interesting. So in the case of diffusion, the best sort of explanation I could come up with, not being a maths person, is it's essentially rearranging a bunch of video noise. So it's like you have an image which is a bunch of pixels that are not arranged in any particular way, and you're shuffling them around based on a set of predetermined weighted values to achieve the arrangement of pixels, which is at the highest probability of what it thinks you want to see. So the key point there for me as a lawyer, and I'll shut up in a second, is that the AI doesn't actually know what it's making. It doesn't know that it's drawing a picture of Mickey Mouse, and it isn't, strictly speaking, copying another picture. So we can talk about how it's trained and some of the pitfalls around that. But the fascinating thing for me was that it literally is just shuffling pixels around to achieve a particular result based on just maths and probability. And that's what, when we talk about AI in the games industry, that's usually what we're talking about.
And if I asked everyone, and probably everyone in the room, to give a definition, we'd have a different one from pretty much everyone. But thank you for setting the scene and getting us up and running. I want to get into the sort of the practicalities, the impact that AI is currently having on the games industry. And Vincent, as our studio representative here, what are you seeing in that space at the moment? What's AI doing for games?
Well, so we've obviously had AI for a long time. So, and what I would call AI, NPC behaviors in games is I think some experts might say it's not really AI, but there's no actual learning going on, certainly not in the games that I've played. But we've had AI as a pair of letters for quite a long time. But it's the generative AI that I think is really interesting for us as a studio that Kostya mentioned. So we are a content business, and something which will generate new content is really interesting because we don't have a huge amount of money, and methods for being able to create new content kind of cost-effective way are interesting. But we don't see this as a kind of a replacement of people. A lot of the press talk about kind of a load of people losing their jobs because they're going to get taken over by bots. I just don't see it that way. What I do see is something which really means that our own people are able to be more productive and do stuff that is more interesting for them, because a lot of the perhaps duller aspects of what they're doing is taken over by a computer. So that's how we would want to see it. We wouldn't see it as being something that just replaces people. We see it as something which potentially will create a lot of good starting points, which they can then build on and use the expertise that they've got, which computers don't have. As Kostya mentioned, the things to know what it's doing. But it will produce lots of things very quickly. And if we could find a way of building our business around taking that and actually then adding a human element to it, even if it's not just choosing which we like and which bits we don't like of the content, but also then adding to it, refining it, improving it, then that is potentially very interesting, because it might mean that we can create more content with the same amount of people. It certainly doesn't mean we'll create the same amount of content with less people, because ultimately video games is very much a people creative business. The one thing which certainly is a concern, which I'm sure we're going to touch on later, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, is the methodology by which these programs create content. They've got to get it right, or they'll end up on the wrong side of an infringement line. And what I, as a business, can't do is start using a tool which might introduce infringing items into my pipeline, because that could bring my business down ultimately. Our content at the moment is made entirely by our employees. We know who they are. Everyone's there working. All right, someone might nick something off the internet, but on the whole, we can really protect against that, mitigate against that. If you introduce a new form of creative input from a machine and no one really fully understands how it's coming up with this, that is certainly introducing a risk. And at some stage, someone, it might be a lawyer, it might be a judge in the UK, it might be a judge in the courts of East Texas, is going to look at this and start making decisions about whether the output is infringing or not. And I don't want to be in a position where all of a sudden I'm using a tool which is creating infringing output and I've not even known about it. So that's something that I'm going to be watching very carefully before we even start using generative AI in our business.
So 7 minutes in and infringement is mentioned already. It's the nature of this conversation, is it? Do either of the other panelists have any sort of views on what's happening with AI in the games industry today? Phil, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, just touching on the infringement side, I see AI as like a new tool in the toolbox. But I think if you're going to put something in one of your products, the onus is still going to be on you to make sure that it's not infringing on someone else's works. And you can't just assume that because AI has created it, it's unique. If you ask AI, go and make me something that looks like Mickey Mouse, and then you put it in your product, and don't be surprised if Disney come knocking. So I would see these tools as tools, but you still have to be mindful of what you're putting in there, and don't just, willy-nilly put stuff in that could be infringing and think it's fine. So I see AI as a really useful tool, as Vince said, to be more productive, but you still have to be careful with it. And yeah, it's not just about images either. You can use Copilot is something I've been learning about, where you can use it to assist you with creating code. But again, you have to be careful about, well, where's it pulling in the information from? There's a couple of lawsuits going on at the moment between a couple of artists trying to sue Stable Diffusion, and there's the Getty Images one with Midjourney, where Midjourney created this image of these footballers, and it still had the Getty Images watermark sort of vaguely visible on there, it's not a good look for them. So, but I think they're interesting because the lawsuit is against Midjourney and Stable Diffusion rather than the companies that sort of put the images out there. So if any of you guys wanted to put stuff in your products, Midjourney, for example, might be vicariously liable, but ultimately you're responsible for the content that you put out there. So, the onus is still on you.
I'd just sorry to interrupt. I would add on that point that I've not looked at their specific terms and conditions, but certainly OpenAI, I think that they say, you're responsible for your content. We're not taking any responsibility. And what's more, if someone sues us, the AI provider, based on something that you've done, you've got to pay us the costs of that as well. So you're indemnifying.
I'm sure everybody reads those very carefully
Exactly.
before accepting.
Well, maybe they're impenetrable, like a lot of legal documents, don't you think?
Yeah, deliberately. So.
Yeah, deliberately. So,
Yeah.
well, you heard it here. Any more sort of war stories you want to share? You can learn a lot from the challenges that the industry are facing, if you can learn from those experiences. Are there any other sort of real life examples you want to share with our audience?
Not many about AI, but in a way, it's really not that different. This is what you were saying, Vincent, that it's not that different to in the olden days, somebody nicking something off the internet when they shouldn't have, and then incorporating it into the final product. Using that as a very crude example, it's the same two issues that arise. Firstly, have you infringed somebody else's rights? And secondly, can you truly claim to own the copyright or other intellectual property rights in the output that you've produced? Because obviously, if it's not original, then it's not a copyright work in which you own the rights. It's at best a derivative work, something that somebody else created. Really, it's no different here, except rather than copying something off Google Images, you're using this thing to create it for you. Now, the interesting bit comes in to, when eventually the law gets to the point where it starts to catch up with this, which could be years before we get to that stage, and we start truly examining whether an infringing act has occurred. Because copyright law in this country was written in the 80s. So you can imagine it's sort of only just catching up with the internet, let alone the stuff we're talking about now. So the language is still copying, right? It's a reproduction of the whole or a substantial part of the original work. And you can sort of see how in the training process, if you're compiling a database to train your machine learning model on, and you're copying a bunch of images from somewhere onto, a hard drive somewhere, and then passing it through the train, that initial act of copying, you can see how that's copying. But everything that happens after that, it's a lot more woolly, and we really don't know is the truth whether it's infringing or not until we have a court and a judge sit down and look at this and make a decision, because we just don't know whether taking data, abstracting it to create a set of weighted values, whether those weighted values could themselves be a derivative work of the original copyright work that was used to train it. So this is like getting really esoteric, deep into the sort of thing that you'd write essays about at uni when you're studying copyright law, but we just don't know. And until, somebody big enough gets it wrong and is a big enough target for somebody else to sue, and that goes, and both parties have enough money to both sue and be sued all the way through to trial and a decision by a judge, we really won't know the answer to that. Luckily, we have the United States, where litigation is far more common, so I'm sure they will lead the way in that respect, and then I'm sure we'll eventually have case law on this in Europe and the UK as well.
You sound like you're looking forward to that. Two companies banging
Yeah.
heads together trying to work it out.
Can you tell? I wish I was a litigator in the US. You have all these juicy cases that, yeah.
Vincent, do you have a view on the sort of the ownership of this AI generated content?
Well, I mean, that is quite a mystery as to certainly legally, the terms and conditions that I already mentioned, they will say, we, the AI company, or at least OpenAI say that, we're not making any claim on the output, so you own it. And so as between you who puts the data in and the AI company, it's quite clear. But then there is the issue of who are the people who own all the stuff that's being used by the AI program. They might have a thing to say about it, which has already been mentioned. You can imagine a worst case scenario that an AI program has simply only ever used Getty image for content. Maybe Getty image do have quite a strong case. And at some point, someone's going to look and see all of the content that's been accessible and how much of that has been legally available to be incorporated into a program. It's not dissimilar to kind of the situation that you would get with concept art, where someone would say, like, I want a generic landscape of a building, and here are 20 reference images, and someone would look at the reference images and then ideally create their own, which is not copying any of those, but
Ideally in their head, without making any.
subsuming the underlying reality of what is shown in all those different pictures. And that's what a lot of concept artists would do. They're often given reference material which is in itself protected. What's different this time is that the computer is doing that, and the computer can be interrogated. Someone can look at how it does it and fully understand how it's taken each individual bit of the reference material and reworked it, which you just can't do if you just asked an individual to look at a load of pictures and then come up with their own generic thing. That's just not possible. It's just going on inside their heads. This time you can actually do the equivalent of looking inside someone's head and seeing exactly each individual stage. And as Costa said, there's no doubt that you don't just need to mechanically copy something to infringe copyright. You can look at a picture and say, I'm going to do the same thing myself. And there's a case with a picture of London, red bus going over Westminster Bridge, and someone asked to be able to reproduce the photo that someone originally made. The creator said no, so they went, all right, stuff you, we'll make our own version. And they did create their own version, slightly different in all different respects. It was created from scratch, but it was still based on someone else's picture, and that was a blatant infringement. And that, if the computers are doing that, then they're just infringing. And so the ownership would really be down to the actual person who owns the original work.
If anybody can own it, because the debate happening in the US at the moment is whether copyright can even exist in a work not created by a human being. At the moment, the answer is no. So that's going to the Supreme Court, and that will be decided. Hopefully, it'll be a yes eventually, because that seems crazy. The UK, weirdly, we've ended up way ahead of the curve, because somebody had the genius idea to write this into our Copyright Act, that you can have copyright works that are not authored by humans. So they're called computer-generated works, and there's a whole subsection that deals with that. And the answer is yes, copyright can exist. It still has to be original if it's a literary, dramatic, or artistic or musical work. You still have to meet that originality threshold. But yes, copyright can exist. And then we can have a debate about who should be the owner, because the subsection says it's the person who put in place the arrangements for the creation of the work. But then what does that mean? Is that me typing in the prompt? Is that the guy who sold me the prompt on a prompt selling marketplace? Or is that, the person who touched it up after the output was spat out at the end? Or is it a combination of all three of those who own it jointly?
I think it should be part of the process, but not the whole process. So you could use AI to get you to a point and then, add to it and add your own twist on it, but don't just present it as the final product, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, the safest thing, like talking practical steps that can be taken, is really just to have, until we know more about how this works from a legal infringement perspective, it's just to have an air gap between whatever is being done with the AI here and your finished product over here. So just have a gap in the middle where there is no kind of electronic bridge between the two. You know, you have human intervention and then a person starting with a clean sheet with a demonstrable creative process that's saved, and you can go back and show the earlier sketches. Worst case scenario, if you end up in court and you have to show independent creation, you have stuff to go back to and say, here's how I arrived at that result.
Yeah, or you just make sure you keep it out of your products. So we might be much happier to use generative AI to write a press release, because even if the thing is infringing to the nth degree, I don't care. No one's going to care. No one's going to sue us for that. If it goes into a game and it ends up in a character, then that's a business-threatening position. So it really depends on the context of where you're using it.
Phil, I'm going to come to you in a second and ask about the insurance view on this, insurance industry's view on this. But just preparing our audience after I've asked Phil this question. If you have any questions, I will come to the audience. Feel free to put our speakers on the spot with some nice awkward ones. So Phil, what's going on in the insurance industry at the moment? What's their sort of view on AI, if they have one?
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting. So to prepare for this, I reached out to all of our insurers that we regularly work with, and I said, hey guys, like, this is a thing. What are you doing about it? Are you considering AI? What are your thoughts from a risk perspective? And they all came back, well, the ones that did come back said they're aware of it and they haven't seen any claims yet, but they see it as a when, not if. But they would see it, well, it still falls under a copyright claim. It's still a copyright issue. So that would be, assuming you're buying that kind of coverage, that would still be covered. And they're just taking a sort of wait and see what happens approach, which is like typical of insurers. They just want to sort of wait and see what happens and then try and adjust the prices afterwards. But I think what we might see is start to see a few new questions creeping in to application forms where the insurers will say, well, are you working with AI? And if people say yes, there'll be a follow-up to say, well, okay, well, if you are doing that, that's maybe cool, but what are you doing to then sign off on the work, and how are you checking that it's kind of like clean and you're not just, you know, ripping stuff off? Because as I said earlier, the onus is still going to be on them to make sure that it's not infringing. So yeah, that's kind of insurers typically just like, oh, we're aware of it, and they've said, well, let's wait and see, let's wait for the claims to roll in, and we'll sort of pivot then.
Are they looking forward to the claims rolling in, do you think?
Yeah, no, they're not looking forward to the claims, but they don't know how big they're going to be and what sort of things are going to come in. I think there's a lot of like new uses for AI, and people are experimenting with it. So there's a lot of stuff that I think is around the corner that people haven't maybe thought of and thought, oh, this is a new way that we can use AI. And that's going to cause all sorts of problems. So insurers are kind of like just gritting their teeth. They are continuing to cover this. It just falls under copyright at the moment for most policies, but they are kind of like waiting with gritted teeth, like, okay, let's see what happens. So yeah.
But it's the point Vincent made as well, that at the moment, the people who've been sued are the AI companies, not the companies using the AI. So really, we might not know that for a while, because the juicier target is the kind of the enabler of the alleged infringement.
Yeah, and they're trying to wash their hands of it and waive liability, which I can see that point. If you ask Midjourney to go and make a Mickey Mouse character, that's not really their fault. That's kind of on you.
Not enough for Mickey here. 3 Mickey references in one panel. I've never had that before. So we've heard a little bit about sort of copyright and intellectual property sort of overlap with that. Just to let you know that Costa's kindly written an updated intellectual property guide for UK. It will be on our website. So feel free to go and have a look at that at uk.org.uk. It's a free resource. Go and use it. So any questions from the audience now? There is a microphone over there. Yes, do you want to start with the individual closest to you? Sorry that you've lost out because geographically you're not at the front, but we will come down to you. So yes, indeed, just stand up. And if you don't mind just saying your name, that would be wonderful.
Hello, I'm Carl. I work on the esports side of gaming. Thank you so much for the panel. It's very interesting. I just want to get an idea of how many degrees of separation, we touched on this a little bit, how many degrees of separation for us to start getting in trouble. So for example, Riot Games and Valve have sort of drawn a line in the sand and said very openly, if you want to do a cosplay or want to do a story or fan story or something, then we're not going to go after you. But as soon as you commercialize that, then suddenly we'll get lawyers in. So if I were to train an AI on someone based on a cosplay image or a fan fiction or something like that, and then but then obviously I might have two problems, because then the person who made the original fan story or cosplay might have a claim, but then Riot Games or Valve, because it's based on their characters, could also have a claim, but then Valve, because it's been commercialized. So I just kind of want to know, like, I know it's kind of going down the well a little bit here, but where do I sit in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, there's no universal answer. The truth is, all of these, and this isn't strictly to do with AI, but like all of the Let's Play videos, or the vast majority, let's say, of the Let's Play videos, the Twitch streams, the user-generated content based on video games that's out there, the vast majority of it is technically infringing, right? By law, it is infringing. The reality is, games publishers have made the commercial decision not to pursue a lot of that stuff, because there's always an internal tension within the bigger publishers between the marketing teams and the legal teams. But a decision has been made by the business not to go after that stuff, and that's why a lot of them, or some of them, the more organized ones, have made public-facing policies saying you can do cosplay, you can do Let's Play videos, you can do things that aren't necessarily covered by the fair dealing and fair use exceptions, but we're still not going to go after you as long as you adhere to these 10 rules. I don't know of any policies like that for AI-generated content yet. I think it's too early for that. There might be in due course. There might be a little add-on saying, oh, and by the way, feel free to use generative AI as long as da-da-da-da-da. We're not quite there yet. But at the end of the day, it's up to each company. And there are some companies, Nintendo, for example, that have a very different outlook on content created based on their IP rights, and that's fine, and they're allowed to do that. But yeah, it's difficult to generalize. I think eventually we'll get to a point where, as you say, a line will be drawn. We just don't quite know exactly where that line is. I suspect it will depend on how flagrant the infringers are, and how much money, if any, is being made from it.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Carl, for that question.
I'm Sophie.
Go, Sophie. Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi, I'm Sophie. You talked a lot about how our understanding of IP law and ownership has influenced how we use and interact with AI. Do you think we're going to see it work the other way around, where AI will change our relationship with IP and ownership law?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you guys probably have thoughts on this as well. The law is really slow. It is extreme. You think regulators are slow, or government is slow. The law is even slower than that, because actually, at the end of the day, it has to be created by Parliament, right? Primary legislation has to go through this extremely arduous process. I think it will react to it eventually. I think and when we say our relationship with IP, at the end of the day, IP is governed by the laws that say what you can and can't do, what monopolies or qualified monopolies you are and aren't allowed to have. It's government that gives you that right, basically. There's like a social contract. I think that will evolve, but it's going to be not anytime soon. And in the meantime, we're going to be desperately plugging back gaps as best we can through case law and people, suing each other, basically.
That is a really good question. Historically, copyright law, it came into existence purely because of technological advances. It was really invented by London booksellers to stop Scottish booksellers from undercutting them, and it arose purely because of the existence of the mass production and printing press, and otherwise it wouldn't have happened. So that hence the emphasis in certainly in Anglo-Saxon countries purely on copying and economic aspects, whereas in continental Europe, the emphasis is equally on respecting the creator as well as the economic side. In Anglo-Saxon countries, it is purely down to money, and it all arose through technology. So I think it's quite possible, actually, that it is quite a radical change, and that may engender some fairly radical changes in the law, which will have to evolve to adapt. And the way it will evolve will again it will be changed in favour of the people who are funding the political parties in charge. So the modern equivalent of the London booksellers will be writing the laws for AI in the future.
That's so bleak, but true.
Lovely. I think I have a question from the front here.
Hi, my name's Mia. I'm in legal services. And so I have a question about the way that we train AI. Do you think that the big, huge, like video game giants who have a lot of intellectual property that they have ownership of are going to start using creating their own databases from which to train AI in order to circumvent the problem of infringement? And what do you think that'll look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is actually a really good point, and it's a really neat way of avoiding the infringement. If you only feed it stuff that you own, obviously there can be no argument that the output is something. Well, there's still a question about whether you can own the output because of this US point, whether you have a human author or not. But assuming we overcome that, there's no argument of infringement. In terms of what that looks like, I don't know. I mean, it feels a bit like it's just a race to the lowest common denominator, isn't it? You know, there's going to be this generic mass of Disney princess films based on other Disney princess films that already exist, and eventually it will all just be exactly the same. Maybe that's a bit too Black Mirror, but I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, arguably already there, aren't we?
Yeah. It makes sense to protect themselves, but whether that pool is going to be interesting enough to draw from. I mean, if you're trying to create concept art, you want a wide variety of stuff. So, I mean, if they're that worried about infringement, just don't use AI at all. Then,
or use a licensed database. And really, this is what
yeah.
Getty wants. So
Yeah.
Getty, you know, in their case, what they've said is we're not trying to stop you. Of course, we're going to pretend like we want to stop you, but what we really want is for you to take a license from us. What we want to have is this new type of Getty license called an AI database license or whatever. You will pay us some money, and then you can train your stuff on the stuff that we have. So it generates a new income stream. So I think there will be databases where people will go and they will license a bunch of material to train their machine learning model, and there will be, you know, warranties and indemnities in the terms and conditions, which give some protection, or at least insofar as you can trust the party from whom you're licensed. But, you know, if it's like Microsoft licensing you a big database to train your AI on, you can probably lean on that quite heavily. And so I can see that happening in the future.
I'm sure that's exactly what's happening already. That the legal dude at Activision has gone, right, we want our own database, our own stuff, and then I'm not going to get any of this kind of problem. So get going and start doing it. I'm sure they're doing that already. I agree. It's going to limit the output as well as the input, but then it's rock solid.
This is why we need humans still involved in that final step to avoid that kind of race to the bottom. We need the human intervention, like at the final stage before you put it into the product.
Yeah, I think it'd be a shame to try and put it back in the box now. I think the horse is bolted, and the stuff that's being put out there is really cool. We just got to find a way that we can use it compliantly.
Some really good questions from the audience there. I'm sorry, our time is almost up, so I'm just going to go to the panel and ask them one final question. So I apologise if you've not been able to get your question in. They're much better than my questions. I should have gone to you earlier. Just one final, and maybe even, who knows, a positive thought about the opportunity of AI for our industry. Phil, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I just think it's a really cool new tool in people's toolbox. But I don't think it's going to replace anything. I think it's just another way to create new stuff.
Fabulous, thank you.
I'm going to steal Vincent's point and say that, like, we as consumers have an insatiable appetite for content, and there's never been a point where there's been too much content. And if this is a tool that helps us create more good stuff, provided it's good stuff and we still keep the humans involved, I can only see it being a positive thing.
Yeah, I went to a talk that Costa gave a few months ago, and he showed a picture that AI had come up with, and it was just grotesque. It was like a nightmare. But you do think actually you might get something weirdly creative out of these machines, given that they don't have a creative pixel in their body, if you like. We might still come up with something that is radically different from the stuff that we already do. Which would be interesting in itself. We're always up for something that's totally new. What I've seen so far has been just terrifying, but there might be something that's actually quite nice that comes out of it. But we can't rule that out anyway.
And that's a lovely note to end on. Thank you very much, Vince. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for the panel, but most of all, I'd like you to put your hands together and thank our panelists, Vincent, Costa, and